Hello, everyone. This is Olivia from the HEA, the Hydrogen Energy Association, on our next series of Hydrogen Bytes. Hydrogen Bytes is a lunchtime webinar series showing the breadth and depth of our memberships offering. And today we are joined with AVL, Jon Caine, Technical Director at AVL Powertrain UK. Before we hand over the baton to Jon, I'm just going to give you a little quick overview over who the HEA are. We are the leading UK hydrogen trade group in the UK with over 110 members right across the value chain, from low carbon production methods, transportation and storage, and various use applications, as well as lots of members of the UK supply chain and in professional services as well. If everybody is okay, this session will be recorded today. Without further ado, I'll pass the baton on over to Jon, our next guest on Hydrogen Bytes.
Okay, thanks, Olivia. Right, I'll get sharing and we'll get started. So what I'd like to do today is just talk a little bit about unravelling the hydrogen opportunity. And I'll start with just a brief introduction to AVL, who we are, and what we do. So we were founded back in 1948, so we went through our 75th anniversary last year. We have 45 global tech centres in 26 different countries, and we have 4 of those here in the UK. We've got 11,000 employees worldwide, and being an engineering consultancy, 68% of our staff are engineers and scientists. And in order to stay at the forefront of all of the technologies that we're dealing with, we invest about 11% of our turnover back into R&D. And that's involved about 2,000 patents being granted. Looking specifically at hydrogen and fuel cell technology in numbers, we have test facilities specific to hydrogen and fuel cells in 6 locations in the world. We engineer in a lot more, and we do hydrogen work in a lot more. And we have about 650 people actively engaged in hydrogen and hydrogen technologies. We have over 200 patents, and the share outside of our traditional automotive world is about 50%. We're active in the field of e-mobility. We entered the battery market and the fuel cell market about 20 years ago. And part of the reason for doing that was to get to the forefront of the new and emergent technologies. We also are looking at energy and infrastructure, the electric drivetrain, including the EDUs and the electric motors, and also the full propulsion systems, including all of the transmissions, drive lines, things like torque vectoring and autonomous driving. So with that as a quick introduction, I'll start to talk about hydrogen and where we view the hydrogen roadmap. So if we start to think about the next 5 years, what we're seeing there's going to be an increase in the electrolyzer capacity, which will start to drive the cost of hydrogen down. That will all be predominantly local production. And beyond that, what we'll see is we'll start to see the emergence of short localized trading. And so that maybe will take us up to about 2035. Beyond that, we actually see a global trading economy coming in, especially as we start to replace oil and gas. And in a similar manner to how we see crude oil global trading today, we expect that to start to emerge for hydrogen and hydrogen-related products. So the first thing we have to do when we're talking about hydrogen is we actually have to think about how we generate it. And when we start to look at the electrolyzers, there's a number of different technologies that are available today. So we have the alkali electrolyzers. They are about 80 to 90% of the electrolyzer market today. And you can see they have reasonably good efficiencies of about 58%. We're seeing an emergence of PEM as well, so that accounts for the bulk of the rest of the electrolyzer market today at about 60%. And each of those 2 technologies have got their pros and their cons. So it's very much a case of playing upon the strengths of the relative systems. We're seeing the solid oxide electrolyzers starting to come through as well. We'll see some examples of that in a minute. And they're starting to hit significantly higher efficiencies. However, they're also bulkier, heavier, and so they're more or less deployable for that respect. So let's look at an example of that. So here's a 1 megawatt, 40-foot container solid oxide electrolysis system. And this system is based around the Ceres fuel cell. and it's an excellent system from Ceres. And we used that to demonstrate an 87% efficiency in the complete module integration and build-up. And that's now being sent out to Bangalore in India, having achieved that great milestone. When we have the hydrogen, the other thing we have to do is use it somehow. There are a number of ways in which we can use it, and the first one that maybe is a little bit more traditional is we can burn it in an internal combustion engine. Now, hydrogen is actually quite a good fuel for internal combustion, and we already see people like JCB nailing their colours firmly to the mast in public, going for the hydrogen internal combustion. We're also seeing a lot of interest in the market generally, and so you can see there on the top left the commercial engine that we've developed in order to demonstrate the capability of hydrogen. It does have a significant number of changes, and there are some challenges with using hydrogen as a fuel. But those are all challenges that we understand, having developed engines for 75 to 100 years. We understand all of those challenges, and they're relatively containable from an engineering perspective. And so you can see the results from the engine. If you look on the top right, you see the brake thermal efficiency. We're achieving a peak brake thermal efficiency of about 43%, which for those of you with an internal combustion engine background, you'll realise that that's an extremely good efficiency. And the map is fairly flat as well, so we get that efficiency across a wide operating range of the engine. The other thing we can do is we can use that in a PEM fuel cell. So here you see a short stack, and here we've achieved 6 kilowatts per litre, and that's actually been demonstrated out of the fuel cell itself. You take the individual plates within the stack, you build that into a full stack, and then you build into the balance of plant. So you can see the balance of plant and how that's been built up. The balance of plant we're seeing here in the middle is a balance of plant that has been on test, and is that then going into the fuel cell demonstrator truck. Now, one thing that AVL does do is we don't offer the actual product because we're an engineering service provider. We're looking at this in order to develop the technology to have that available to our customers. The other reason we develop all of this technology as well is that we develop the tool sets that allow you to optimize. So here are some examples of the tool sets that we have. So AVL Fire and AVL Cruise. AVL Fire is a multi-physics CFD. So this allows you to model all of the chemical reactions, the heat transfers, and all of the thermal effects within the fuel cell or the electrolyzer. It also allows us to do an optimization as well. So there's a built-in optimizer. So you can set certain parameters, certain boundary, and you can let the program optimize for the ideal conditions and run through various scenarios. And that, again, is a way of getting the maximum out of the minimum amount of fuel cell. It's not just about road transport and static power. So here we see an example of a 325 kilowatt marine fuel cell system. So the system that you see on the left-hand side there, that was on test last year. And that's been developed for marine applications. And so you will see things like this going into things like the Blue Danube project, where this is an ideal size for river transport, so major river transports. And this system is going into production this year. Another reference project that very kindly the customers allowed us to share is the Ineos fuel cell Grenadier demo car. And so this was a vehicle that was built up, was demonstrated at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and it's quite a rugged vehicle, and it shows the capability that you have within fuel cells now as a technology. Let's move on a little bit from using the hydrogen directly. So we can also use hydrogen as an energy vector to transfer that into power to liquid. So here's an example of where you take CO2, water, power, and air. And here we go through an electrolysis step, and then we take it further on through water gas shift and Fischer-Tropsch in order to create synthetic fuels. And by doing this as a product, then what we can actually do is we can use the waste from one step in the process through into the next step. And so we're aiming for an improvement of 30% efficiency in this process. And you can actually see in the bottom right hand side here the pilot plant that we've built out in Graz in Austria at our headquarters. Another big thing that you can do with the hydrogen is you can turn it back to power. So it's quite a useful approach to take that and put it back through a solid oxide fuel cell and to go for combined heat and power. And here we can achieve efficiencies of 50-odd%. And the benefit here as well is that when we're talking about these efficiencies, what the losses are still available as heat. So when you're talking about combined heat and power, not only are you getting very high efficiency, but you can also use the waste energy in order to do heating of buildings. And this whole system has got a very high system robustness. The other nice thing about the solid oxide fuel cells is that you can use them as a modular system. So here are some examples of different fuel cell systems that we've been producing. Modularization again is the key, so you can put a number of these systems together, and you can look at also the idea of dual fueling. So as of today, the predominant fuel that is being used is natural gas, and in some cases liquid petroleum gas. But these systems are hydrogen ready as well. So as we start to generate the hydrogen, as hydrogen starts to become the energy vector, then we can start to blend that into the natural gas, and we can run those into the solid oxide fuel cells. So that was the quick 10-minute walkthrough. And we really do see hydrogen as the common denominator across all of the industries. So we see it going into the transport, either directly as hydrogen or being transferred through into alternative fuels for aviation and potentially marine. I didn't mention it, but we do see marine going to things like ammonia if we can solve some of the problems related to ammonia. It can be used in power, so we can use it to store underground in the hydrogen systems, and then we can put it back into fuel cells in order to repower the grid. It'll be used in industry, and it'll be used in refining, and then it'll be used in the buildings for on-site power and heating. So that gives you a quick 10-minute overview. And with that, I think we're going to go into Q&A. But I will just say that there's a few resources there that you can go in and have a look at some of these systems. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jon. That was a real whistle-top tour through all the different projects and innovations that are happening at AVL. I recommend everyone to pop your questions in the chat. Before we kind of move towards the Q&A questions, Jon, it'd be great if you could just go into a little bit more detail in what you think are the main hydrogen uses for transport in the short, medium and long term, just to kind of give that time scale to people across the different use transport applications.
Sure. So when we're talking about the transport sector, at the moment, one of the things that's limiting us a little bit is the availability of the hydrogen. Now, that very much depends on the country we're talking about. So hydrogen is a lot more available in certain other areas of the globe. But in the medium term, when hydrogen does become available, I see that it will be used in the road transport and in the heavy duty sector and the off-highway sectors. And then for aerospace, we've got good opportunity for smaller vehicles, smaller planes, and for regional transport. I don't see it going through directly into the long haul transport. However, what we will see is the use of hydrogen to generate SAF for long haul planes. When we start to talk about marine, again, it will be the medium sector. So things like the riverboats, the port authorities that could use hydrogen directly. One of the issues that we have with hydrogen, particularly for marine, is the bunkering of the fuel at the port, and having large amounts of hydrogen ready and available for very big ships is going to be a limitation. So again, what we'll probably see is some of the synthetic fuels, maybe ammonia in the case of shipping. However, the jury's still very much out on that because of some of the toxicity issues that we see with ammonia. So that's a little bit of a whistle stop there. One of the other factors that's really important for hydrogen and maybe some of the synthetic fuels is the amount of uptime that you need on the vehicle. So wherever you have a vehicle that needs to be running 24/7, batteries and the slow recharge time of battery vehicles probably won't cut it. And so the quick refueling that you get with a hydrogen vehicle is a major factor. So you can refuel a petrol or diesel in about a minute. You can refuel a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle for a 500 mile range in about 3 minutes. So it's very much usable.
Great. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, which we'll go towards now. One being just a concern around NOx issues with hydrogen combustion, so hydrogen ice. Could we just go into a little bit more detail around that, Jon?
Yeah, so NOx is one of the issues with burning a gas. So depending upon how lean we burn the gas, you'll get more or less NOx coming out. However, one of the things that I will say about NOx is that for the internal combustion engine, generally speaking, we've got very good NOx control now through the SCR systems. They do operate lean. So a modern diesel engine at its tailpipe is actually very, very efficient in terms of its NOx treatment. And so it will become a very, very small issue in the future. And I don't really see it being anywhere near what we have today. The other thing a lot of people don't realize is that when you look at a diesel engine from 10 years ago, the NOx levels are orders of magnitude higher than you get off a modern diesel engine. So I think it is a solution that we already have and we can just deploy for hydrogen engines.
Thanks for providing some clarity on that, Jon. We've got another question around who else AVL are working with other than Ceres Power to develop SOECs and SOFC stacks.
Okay, so in terms of, I can only really tell you about the customers that have allowed us to use them as reference projects. So maybe just to go up to a couple of slides. So you can see some examples there. Mitochondria and Weissman are the two customers that have allowed us to share. Outside of that, if we're working with a customer, unless they publicize it or give us permission, we can't say anything more.
That's great. There's lots more questions coming in through the chat now. We've got one asking, do you offer reversible SOEFC systems working also as electrolyzers? Is there any drawbacks of these reversible systems?
So we definitely do it. In the bottom left side there, you see a reversible solid oxide fuel cell prototype. What I would always say on these is that you will always end up with a small compromise if you try to have a system that can work in reverse. And so you always need to look at whether it's beneficial to have a truly reversible system, or whether it's best to have a system that is working in tandem. And so you have the optimized solid oxide fuel cell with the solid oxide electrolyzer alongside. Now, when we get into the detail, I'd have to call in the experts specifically on that topic. But solid oxide is reversible. PEM, there are differences between an electrolyzer and a fuel cell, so that's far less capable as a reversible system.
Thank you. We've got a question from David Dundas. He's asking here, in the UK, where heavy transport is probably the greatest market for fuel cell grade hydrogen, there are very few filling stations, which is holding up the conversion of heavy transport fleets. What do you see as a way to increase the availability of filling stations?
Well, that's a really good question, and one of the million-dollar questions for the UK at the moment. It's a problem that a lot of Europe has started to solve. So when you actually start to look at the availability in Germany in particular, but through the rest of Europe, they're starting to install it on the motorway network. I think if we want to start taking this seriously, we need to do the same thing. Initially, I see the only way you're going to get good grade hydrogen of the purity that we need for fuel cells, we'll have to start installing electrolyzers. Longer term, hopefully, when we start to get the grid system laid out, and there is discussion within the national grid in order to put hydrogen infrastructure in, then we may see the opportunity there. But I think initially we just need to lay out some splines across the major motorway network. And more than that, I think it really does need some push either from the government, or predominantly from the government, or from the transport network, as we start to see it going through Europe, and then people want to start using the same vehicles from Europe into the UK.
Great. I'll just go straight on to the next question, as there's lots coming through. Any sign of the UK government allowing H2 ICE on HGVs, Jon?
Well, I'm hoping that when you actually read the small print of what the government is actually saying, there's lots and lots of little get out clauses in there. So they talk about a ban on internal combustion engines for diesel or petrol. They're developing standards, and there are standards moving forward for things like EU7. And so if there is a push, and people like JCB are pushing very vocally and very publicly, then hopefully we'll start to see common sense prevail, and that the government will allow it. And personally, I think it will. And I'm saying that partly because we're actually seeing a lot of interest from industry about actually pushing through for internal combustion. And it's a very good potential stopgap, or a very good long-term solution. You saw the sort of efficiencies that we're talking about here at 43%. As we do more and more development, then those numbers can go up. We can make them on the existing manufacturing lines. We can install them into existing vehicles, and we just need to change the fuel systems. So actually, I think they're a great solution going forward. Not the only solution. We need all of the solutions deployed, but I think they're a great solution going forward.
Great, thank you. We've got another question around cost. So in one of the earlier slides, Jon, you showed us a trajectory for hydrogen cost going down to €1 a kilogram. Is that green hydrogen only, and what are the key steps to achieve €1 per kilogram other than international trade?
So I think without international trade, €1 per kilogram is going to be very difficult. One of the things that we're predicting is that when you start to get the international trade, then there's a lot of places around the globe that have got an abundance of good green potential for electricity. So we're talking about places like Chile, the Middle East, and Australia. And so once you start to let the economies drive, there'll be very cheap places to generate the electricity. That allows us to go through the steps to generate hydrogen, and we'll probably go through more to an energy carrier like ammonia. We'll then bring that to Europe, and what we're actually predicting is it will be cheaper to generate the hydrogen in those countries, ship it across to Europe, and then reconvert it than it would be to generate locally. Now, again, one of the nice things about the global market is the economies of scale will allow us to do that, and it will also allow the global market to drive the cost down as competition really starts to bite. So, yeah, watch this space. If we could accurately predict 15 years hence, then we wouldn't be hedging a little bit, but that's where we think it will go.
Great, thanks, Jon. We've got another question around the SOEC electrolyzers. What is the maximum size of SOEC electrolyzers which you think are available, and how many hours can they run before you need to replace the stack?
Okay, so I'll be honest, I'll have to defer to our experts on SOECs, but the 1 megawatt system that we're talking about there is actually a modular system. So if you look inside the container, it's made up of a number of individual stacks, and then it basically goes together for the full 1 megawatt. So I do think that really when you start to talk about modularization, you're looking at typical stack sizes of maybe about 100 kilowatts, and then you modularize them together. You put that with a single balance of plant, and then you add two side by side in order to start to build up your containerized system. Now, that's one of the other nice things about the containerized approach, where we can then just really whatever size you want, But there will come a practical point at which you then start to get limitations on the grid, and it may make more sense to have, say, a 0.5 megawatt or 1 megawatt in multiple locations to start to distribute that out. Especially when you start to look at places like Africa, where we may be talking about generation for places that currently are off-grid.
Okay, on to the next question, John. This is from Freddie Minter at Equans UK. His question is, how sensitive is a solid oxide fuel cell to impurities in H2 versus other, and were lower purity of hydrogen, say from CCUS, likely to impact the performance of the fuel cells over time?
So one of the big advantages that you have with the solid oxides compared to, for example, the PEM, is that because they're operating at a far higher temperature, they're far more resilient to things like carbon monoxide and various other potential pollutants. And in fact, you saw on the slide that many of those systems can actually go as a dual fuel. So that's one of the big advantages, that they can have a significantly lower purity of hydrogen, and they're far more robust to that.
Okay, great. We're just going to do two last questions, I think, John. One being, how sensitive is H2 ice to impurities in comparison with fuel cells?
So again, this is an advantage of H2 ice, that it's pretty insensitive to impurities. The only thing you have to watch is if you start to change the combustion process. But hydrogen is a very fast burning fuel. And so we're already doing an awful lot to slow the combustion down in order to make sure that it doesn't start to pre-ignite. But generally, I think hydrogen ice is pretty good for insensitivity.
And a final question is, what is AVL's thinking around liquid hydrogen as a carrier?
So liquid hydrogen's a really interesting topic. It does take a lot of energy to get down to the liquid state at minus 250 C or whatever it is. But then it does become very dense. The issue that you'll always have with liquid hydrogen is managing the boil-off process. So unless you're going to keep it under significant pressure, which is not practical, you always have to allow a small amount of boil-off. And that's really where, for certain applications like aerospace, where you can fuel the plane when the fuel cell is actually running, and then you have a constant demand through the entire flight profile, then that boil-off's not an issue. But there's no way that you can really think about liquid hydrogen for something that is stop-start. So that's where it would be a big issue, for example, for the ground transport. The other issue with liquid hydrogen is it's more expensive in order to produce it, and more expensive to handle it. And again, that pushes us towards the aerospace, where maybe on an airport, you've got the capability, you've got the infrastructure actually built into the airport, and then you can fuel the planes and away you go.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to an end. We'd like to keep these webinars short and snappy, a knowledge-packed session for 30 minutes during all of your lunch times. It's great to see almost double the amount of attendees than our last Hydrogen Byte. So it's really great to see that this initiative is gaining momentum and is providing valuable opportunity for our members like AVL to share their expertise with the wider industry and other key stakeholders. So thanks very much, Jon, and many thanks coming through in the chat as well. And we will be circulating Jon's slides as a PDF format, so that all the details will be available to you post the session. Thanks a lot, Jon.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for listening. I hope it was informative.